After beating Final Fantasy mode and investing over 150 hours into the game, I believe I'm qualified to make a tier list that'll go over the best abilities in the game. I'll be going in chronological order of when we obtain each icon, and everything will be timestamped for your convenience, so with that out the way, let's get into this, yeah? We start the game off with Phoenix. Even though this is supposed to be an iconic ability tier list, I'll also cover the iconic feats, as these do warrant one of 3 slots. Phoenix Shift is really good for a majority of the game, which allows you to close the distance between you and a foe, and you could do some fun combos with it. I however didn't see myself using this too much in the late game or Final Fantasy mode, as going to the enemy would put you in danger as the enemies are more aggressive and hit harder. As for boss fights, it wasn't needed as they come to you. Overall, Phoenix Shift gets a B rank because it makes trash battles quicker, but for boss fights it felt like having another icon would have been better. Now on to Iconic Abilities. Rising Flame is your first skill. It does decent damage that can knock up smaller enemies for a cool combo, and has a very quick animation. This is a very good starter skill, but that's all it is, as I replaced this ability as soon as I had better damaging options, giving Rising Flames a B rank. Scarlet Cyclone is up next. This can be seen as the AoE version of Rising Flames, as it does decent AoE damage. It does slightly higher will damage, but it suffers the same fate as a starter skill, if not worse, as this does next to nothing versus enemies with a stagger bar or bosses. I unfortunately have to give this the C rank so early. It's a very cool looking skill, but there's a lot better stuff out there to take up our iconic slots. Moving on to Heat Wave. This is our first counter that'll cancel one projectile about to hit us, and it fires back shockwaves at the enemy. The shockwaves can pierce multiple enemies, and each hit does damage twice. On top of all of this, there seems to be a mistranslation, or my interpretation of the skill was wrong. The in-game tooltip says it'll reduce the cooldown by 33%, but in actual usage, this is actually a 66% cooldown reduction. That means they'll take this skill from a 25-second cooldown to 8 seconds, allowing you to use this even more. Almost every single boss has a projectile, making the skill have value throughout your whole playthrough, and with such a short cooldown, it actually does a lot of damage and will damage per second, giving it our first S rank. If you're not using this skill, I highly recommend you give it a try. Our first ultimate iconic ability is Flames of Rebirth. Most ultimate skills pause time, allowing you to get the full value without ever worrying you'll whiff. Flames of Rebirth does good AoE damage and it'll heal you. This utility is very valuable, especially in Final Fantasy mode, where you do not replenish your potions when you die. This utility is mainly why this iconic ability gets the S rank, but for those of you who do not need the heal, it's just a B rank as the AoE damage is okay. Next up, we'll cover our second icon. Garuda's iconic feat is Deadly Embrace. This is a very useful feat as it will pull an enemy from the pack so you can kill them one by one before you get dogpiled. You can pull flying enemies down so you could kill them easier. This may not seem that important in the base game, but when the enemies have their aggro limiter removed, you'll find yourself being attacked by multiple enemies at once in Final Fantasy mode, and this can be the difference between life and death. When an enemy with a stagger bar is 50%, you could pull them to the ground for free damage. This is very useful, and if you build properly, you can stagger an enemy from 50% of the will gauge all the way to 0. For those reasons, Deadly Embrace gets the A rank. Gouge is our first iconic ability. It does very good will damage and you could cleave multiple enemies in front of you. When an enemy is 50%, Deadly Embrace and Gouge is usually enough to stagger them. When staggered, this attack can build up the multiplier quickly. Unfortunately, there are better options later in the game, giving Gouge a B rank. Wicked Wheel is up next. This skill is our first riser that not only lifts multiple enemies into the air, but Clive as well. This is very unique and allows for some fun combos, and also enables down thrust for more damage. A very fun skill to use, but the damage and will damage is mediocre, giving it a B rank. Rook's Gambit is our second counter and our first melee specialized one. It'll jump backwards and then attack. If the jump back evades an attack, then you will do a lot more damage. If multiple enemies are close, then this can cleave all of them. This is a good ability and it'll reward you even more once you know your enemy's attack patterns and move pool, giving it the B rank. It just doesn't come close to Heat Wave. Lastly, our ultimate ability, Aerial Blast. Unlike Flames of Rebirth, it'll pause time to summon a tornado and then everything goes back to normal. The tornado will then seek out foes, and when it finds them, it'll do damage over time and lift small enemies. This skill does very good will damage if you get all the attacks to connect. While this is good in trash battles, it's an overkill as the only enemies that are a real challenge are the formidable foes and bosses who don't get picked up. This means you'll have a big tornado hiding enemies so you don't know when to dodge their attacks, and this actually worked against me than helping me. For that, I'm gonna give Aerial Blast a B rank because I would rather kill the small enemies than handicap myself with this big visual hindrance in combat. Moving on to our third icon. Ifrit doesn't come with an iconic feat, so we'll go straight to the iconic abilities. Will It Awakes is first. It'll summon fireballs around Clive, which will deal very low damage to anyone who touches it, and this can also be consumed to prevent damage 4 times. This does very good will damage, and the fact that it prevents damage up to 4 times is ludicrous. It doesn't matter if the damage was supposed to be 5 or 3000, it just absorbs it. On top of that, it prevents any knockback or knockdown, which is like super armor. This made Final Fantasy mode a lot easier, and I almost felt like I was cheating.
Is this easy mode?
That is why with the power of editing, I had to add a god tier for this ability. Up next is Ignition. This ability allows you to move around and scoop up enemies to set up for AoE if they survive. When used on a boss, it does good damage in and outside of staggered windows, and it has a short cooldown where it feels like it's almost always up if you build a proper rotation. I absolutely loved this skill when I acquired it, and in Final Fantasy mode it got rid of the annoying enemies quickly, so I could focus on the main ones. Ignition easily gets the S rank. Onto our fourth icon. Ramuh's iconic feat is Blind Justice. I remember seeing the trailers and getting really excited for a Kingdom Hearts shotlock. Hell, expectations versus reality soon kicked in as time does not freeze or slow down, so you can get hit out of this. The damage doesn't warrant this skill against most enemies besides the light ones, which are easily dispatched anyway. This only gets worse on Final Fantasy mode when the enemies get even more aggressive. It was a cool idea, but in practical application, this is not efficient at all, giving Ramuh a C tier. His iconic abilities do save him, and Pile Drive is up first. Pile Drive does an AoE attack around Clive's hitbox and knock back enemies which have a longer recovery time than your normal knockback. This is great for giving yourself breathing room, and the damage and will damage is good, but the cooldown is way too long for what it does. For these reasons, I give it a B rank. Thunderstorm is up next. The skill has a startup animation where Clive twirls around the Ramuh staff before summoning lightning on a single foe, which does heavy damage. The startup animation can actually juggle light enemies, but the real reason to use this skill is for the damage. It is one of the strongest attacks for when you acquired it, but it gets outshined later, and not just because of the damage. The slow startup makes you vulnerable to attacks in battles with more than one enemy, which gives it the B rank. Following this is Lightning Rod. This ability is our first stationary skill. It places an orb that when struck by Clive or an enemy will discharge, dealing damage. You can move this orb by pressing the same input you used to place it down. I cannot express how good this skill is. It has so many synergies in the game for a non-ultimate skill. When you acquire this, pair this with Gouge and watch that will gauge get depleted. Later in the video I'll cover more insane synergies with it. Lightning Rod does good AoE damage for trash packs and boss fights on top of will damage, giving it the god tier. Lastly, our ultimate ability, Judgment Bolt. It does insane single target damage with low splash damage. It pauses time and drops 2 lightning bolts on an enemy. This is very good if you use it during a stagger window when you have achieved the 150% damage multiplier. Outside of that, it doesn't do anything special, which gives it an A rank. Moving on to the fifth icon. Titan's iconic feat is Titanic Block. This allows you to hold down your iconic feat button and nullify damage from blockable attacks. There are attacks that can go past the block, and that's where precise blocking comes into play. If you time the block just as an attack is about to hit you, not only will you mitigate the guard breaking attack, but you can now fire back 3 counterattacks at your foe. The last action RPG I played was God of War Ragnarok, so this was an easy staple for my playthrough. Precise blocking and getting those counterattacks was so cool, and it's a nice defensive option while maintaining the offense. This is easily S tier, and if you dedicate some time to learning your foe's attack pattern and move pool, this can be seen as God tier as you'll never take damage with precise blocking. Titan comes in strong with his first iconic ability, Wind Up. It's a punch that can be turned into frontal AoE cleave by landing in the red zone. This is the strongest non-ultimate skill to do massive damage in a short amount of time. It doesn't have any other utilities outside of this, which only gives it the 8 rank. Upheaval is the AoE version of Wind Up. It does good AoE damage and even more if you land in the red zone. If you use this in mid-air, then the charge up disappears and it becomes instantaneous. Pair this with Wicked Wheel for a nice 1-2 combo. By itself, however, it's okay, giving it a B rank as boss and formidable foes are what really matter, and it loses value as most of those fights are single target. Up next is our third counter and our second physical one. Raging Fist is just like our iconic feat, but an ability so you don't have to use Titan to get the value. It can block a guard breaking attack, but instead of doing 3 counterattacks, you'll unleash a barrage of fists at your foe. This can cleave any enemy in the front and it does decent damage. If you block an attack, the cooldown is reduced by 50%, which is huge. This easily gives Raging Fist an A rank. Lastly, our ultimate ability, Earthen Fury. This sends out an attack that gets wider with each extension of the attack. This is good AoE damage if you position properly, especially against big foes who have a large hitbox to get the full value. I unfortunately hardly found myself facing such foes, giving this ultimate a B rank. Now for the 6th icon. Bahamut's iconic feat is Wings of Light. This iconic feat is very unique as you cannot do any attacks or use iconic abilities while in this form. While this may sound terrible, you will be charging up Mega Flare that when used does autonomous damage for a good 15 seconds. When acquiring Bahamut, it'll be your strongest damage source as it does free damage just like Ramuh, as it doesn't take up an iconic ability slot but on a grander scale. I easily surpassed 100k when I acquired this, and it could only get stronger as you get more stats, giving it the S rank. It can be hard to use as you do need to know your enemy's attack pattern and move pool, and like I mentioned for Titan's block, if you learn these, this can be seen as God tier, as the absurd amount of free damage is too good to pass up. It's also to be noted that this is your first rainbow skill to get a high score. Our first iconic ability is Impulse. Just like Mega Flare, this does autonomous damage and goodwill damage. As time passes, the orb's color change, and if you press the same input for Impulse, then you will detonate the orbs doing 50% more damage. This is crazy as this skill has a short cooldown, which gives it a B rank. If you master when to detonate it, then it's actually A rank. Just don't use this in trash battles as the orbs will separate hitting different targets and you will lose that value on a single target. Next up is Flare Breath. When I first saw this, I got super excited because for those who play Final Fantasy XIV, you know the horrors of this tank buster. Well, in Final Fantasy XVI, this skill is an absolute joke. It can be seen as a flamethrower that pushes your enemies together for a nice damage over time, but like all prior skills, light enemies aren't your main concern. It's the formidable foes and bosses. This skill doesn't push them around, but instead the bosses will be pushing you around as you're an easy target to hit. You can cancel the skill into a dodge, but then this skill goes on cooldown, and you have to wait for it to come back up. Why waste an iconic ability slot on something that does mid damage and it's hard to get the full value unless they're staggered, and even when that's happening, you have much better damaging skills to use in that window. It would be a disservice to put this into C rank, so I made a completely new tier list just for this skill alone, and it's dog water. No one should use this skill unless you're in the Chronolit Trials. Satellite saves the day with its great utility. It summons 2 orbs that follow Clive and will activate anytime you press your magic button, even if Clive cannot use his magic, like when he's knocked down for example. This is great for anyone who loves using magic bursts, as this complements your playstyle and can be used during Wings of Light, which lets you keep up some DPS. It does goodwill damage, and for that I'll be giving it a B rank. If you don't use magic a lot, then this is probably a C tier for you. Lastly, our ultimate ability, Giga Flare. Unlike other ultimates, it slows down time and you fire a big Kamehameha at your opponent. It does insane damage and can pierce, hitting multiple targets caught in the blast. It'll easily get the S rank, and if you pair this with Lightning Rod, you will delete most of your foes at this point in the game. Moving on to our 7th icon. Shiva's iconic feat is Cold Snap. This gives you more distance than your regular evade, and if you double tap the button, you could temporarily freeze any foe caught in the radius. If you precise dodge, then it'll freeze an enemy in a bigger radius for a longer time. Throughout my whole playthrough, I was looking for something to manipulate the stagger window, as that's our damage window, but I couldn't find a single accessory to do so. Cold Snap, however, freezes the stagger bar. Isn't that crazy? This combined with a later icon completely breaks the game, and I abused it. Shiva easily gets the god tier as nothing else in the game does what she does, and she made Final Fantasy mode feel like it was easy mode. Our first iconic ability is Ice Age. It works just like Titan's Upheaval or Wind Up, where you have to land in the red zone. This will knock back and knock up small enemies and freeze them for a short time. It's good for giving yourself breathing room or setting up combos, which earns it the B rank. Up next is Mesmerize. This allows you to pull small enemies to you and set up AoE for an easier combo. When used on enemies that have a big hitbox, then you can launch all 6 shards into them for a lot of damage and will damage. Its short cooldown allows you to easily cycle this, giving it the A rank. Moving on to Rhyme. This is our second stationary skill. It does very low damage and places an orb that'll keep smaller enemies trapped inside for continuous damage. You can move it just like Lightning Rod. This, however, comes nowhere close to how strong Lightning Rod is, even though they pair well together for a nice AoE combo, because I'd rather have something more universal in my limited 6 iconic ability slots, giving this the D rank. Lastly, our ultimate ability, Diamond Dust. It pauses time and does 2 attacks back to back that does significant will damage, and if used at 50%, it could break an enemy straight out. If the enemy's broken, then you could get to 150% damage multiplier right away, so all your other iconic abilities do maximum damage. This earns it the God rank, as no other skill in the game does what it does. On to our last icon. Odin's iconic feat is Arms of Darkness. This changes Clive's basic hit and prevents him from building up limit break gauge. You can't use Magic Burst while this is active, and your attacks will deal lower damage. Now this all may seem bad, but when the Zantetsuken gauge fills up, you can let one rip for high AoE damage, single target damage, and it has a large radius. I use this to easily clean out rooms and burst down bosses. You could build up a Zantetsuken before a major boss fight so you don't have to go through all the cons of Arm of Darkness. And you could swap icons and keep the Zantetsuken charge, unlike Bahamut's Wings of Light, which gives Odin the God tier. Odin's first iconic ability is Gungnir. Even though this is usually a powerful weapon to obtain in RPG games, this iconic ability is a joke. It has a long animation that does very little damage, will damage, and it doesn't build up limit break. On top of all of that, it hardly fills the Zantetsuken gauge, which is its main purpose. Just like Flare's Breath, you can easily get knocked out of this, putting the skill on cooldown and not getting much value. Gungnir easily makes it to the D rank, as you're better off with other skills. Heaven's Cloud is up next. This skill is quick on execution and does okay damage. It fills the Zantetsuken gauge better than Gungnir, but that doesn't say much as it suffers from the same flaws. Low damage, will damage, and it doesn't fill up the limit break gauge. It gets the C rank because it's slightly better than Gungnir. Moving on to Rift Slip. This skill lets you animation cancel anything in the game for a cooler flowing combo. It can also be used to set up skills easier, as it slows down time if you cancel an ability or action like a basic swing. I abuse this with Cold Snap from Shiva to do a triple Zantetsuken rotation. It easily gets the God tier, as it allows for things that were previously impossible. Lastly, our ultimate ability, Dancing Steel. It does pause time, but it has a long wind up that you could get knocked out of it. If you do get it to go off, then it'll be like Gungnir, low damage, will damage, and no limit break being refilled. This is an absolute joke of an ultimate ability. Now if you pair this with Odin, it actually fills the Zantetsuken gauge better than the rest, and with the right combination like Lightning Rod, you can get to level 5 every time. This skill is D rank, but if you pair it with Odin, it's actually S tier. Hopefully this video helped you understand which abilities are worth using, and if you enjoyed this video, consider checking out the channel for in-depth guides on each icon and iconic abilities, and perhaps subscribing to see more, as I plan on making a ton of videos for Final Fantasy XVI, and I play a wide array of RPG games, and I break them down just like this. Until the next video, I'll see ya.